Okay, Tim and I are doing this together because one of the things that's happened over the last few years, since I've been teaching at Bethlehem Tertiary Institute, is that Tim is one of my regular guest lecturers. And it is really nice to be able to introduce someone who is an Old Testament specialist with a particular interest in families to come and talk in my families paper. So it's really nice to be able to do this introduction to us. I'm starting off and then Tim will take over and then we will interweave what we're going to be saying. As you can probably tell, I'm not a native-born Kiwi. I'm originally from Northern Ireland. Tim's English. We spent time in England, in Belgium, worked for the British Baptist Missionary Society in Kinshasa, and we arrived in New Zealand just over 18 years ago. We have been married now for just over 35 years, and we have 4 adult children who are, some are here and some are overseas, so that's the way it is with our family. It was really good to hear the last session and to hear one of the comments at the end about why people are involved in gangs or involved in groups and the sense of belonging, the sense of family. When I worked as a family therapist in South Auckland, I was with Baptist Family Services years ago and then with Counties Manukau Health Board for 10 years. One of the things that really interested me was a speaker who came and talked about her work with girl gangs and the fact that girls were in gangs because of the dysfunction in their family and the sense of belonging which they got from being within these gangs. So it's been really interesting, a whole lot of different things in my life coming together, and now I'm teaching at Bethlehem Tertiary Institute and able to, from a Christian perspective, look at what families are, how we work with families, and what it means to be in a family. I just want very quickly to talk about the current state of families in New Zealand. When I was preparing this, I got a bit carried away with the amount of statistics that are available, and there were lots and lots of slides, and then they got cut down. But very, very quickly, families are really in a state of change at the moment. To think of families as being mum, dad, and the kids just really doesn't cut it. Most growth is within the group of couples without children. Whether the children, as with us, the children are grown up and no longer living at home, or whether they're couples who do not have children. So we're actually looking at a different way of talking about families. What does family mean? Also, in New Zealand, 31% of the people who got married in 2009, so almost 1 in 3 people who were getting married were actually getting married for the second or third or subsequent time. So nearly a third of people getting married have been married before. As a family therapist, I've done a huge amount of work with adolescents who come from a whole range of family situations, and one of the striking things is the huge increase in the number of children and adolescents in New Zealand who actually don't live with both parents. As you'll see, in 1976, so just after Tim and I got married, in New Zealand they reckon about 90% of all children lived with both their parents. But by 2006, that had gone down to 72%. So if you take it, if 72% of children live with both parents, then actually 28% of children do not live with both parents. And I particularly want to mention the increasing numbers of children who were brought up by their grandparents. So when we think of family, we think of a whole combination, different permutations. We think of mum and the kids, we think of dad and the kids, we think of the families who co-parent, where the children might be with one parent for 3.5 days a week, another parent 3.5 days a week. They're with mum for 12 days, and then they go to dad for every other weekend. And these sorts of patterns, and we've been looking at gospel and family. So how does the church, how do as Christians we cope with, deal with, work with families that do not have this traditional, as we see it, mum and dad and the kids format? If we look at not just marriage, but the opposite of marriage, of separation and divorce, In New Zealand, as you might think from the statistics that I've given before about how many people are actually going into a second or subsequent marriage, 1/3 of New Zealand marriages end in divorce. 1/3 of New Zealand marriages end in divorce, and Christian marriages are no different. It was quite hard to find recent research about Christian divorce statistics in New Zealand, but from the US and other Western countries, between 1/4 and 1/3 of mainline Protestant Christians are divorced. So if we look at the number of marriages, we look at the number of divorces, we look at separations, we look at a whole range of things, what is it that's going on? And one of my questions would be, why is there no difference between marriage and family within the church and the permutations within the church and outside of the church?
So Barbara's begun by introducing the state of family and marriage in New Zealand today. I got interested in the topic a few years ago when Kerry, we have a capstone course for our Bachelor of Applied Theology degree, where students are encouraged to bring their studies from the different disciplines together. And at that time, the different teachers used to approach the topic from the perspective of their topic. And our topic that year was family, so I was asked to do a session on family in the Old Testament. I thought, that's easy. Obvious. You start with Genesis 2, because that's where Jesus and Paul started. And from Genesis 2, you move on, and eventually you end up in Proverbs, and it's all going to be nice and simple and comfortable. It doesn't work like that. Just think about the families in the Bible. Well, okay, there's Adam and Eve and their children. It gets a little bit touchy because Cain kills Abel, and to be honest, things go downhill from there. I mean, you think of the great heroes of the Old Testament. Men like Jacob. Well, maybe don't think of Jacob with his 2 wives and the servant girls and... well, okay, men like David. No, don't think of David, that's even worse. Okay, Abraham. Abraham's safe. Abraham's always safe. No, there's Hagar, isn't there? And so it goes on. And it doesn't get much better when you look in the New Testament. And even if you think of the Holy Family, you've got an unwed mother at the beginning of things. Wherever you look in the Bible, what you find is not a nice, comfortable model family that we can hold up to all the people in our churches and say, this is what your family should be like. What we find are broken families of various sorts, with different kinds of brokenness, all through the Bible, from beginning to end. So then I thought, well, okay, this is getting a bit awkward. I'll look and see the words that get translated, family, in English translations of the Bible. And then I can go back and do some nice word studies of Hebrew and Greek, and that's all very safe. That doesn't quite work either, because you very swiftly find that translators of the Bible have almost always translated in the Old Testament words that mean something more like aku or whanau as family. And in both parts of the Bible, the other words that get translated family mean what in the New Testament was a household, which was a patriarch, and all the people who happened to live with that patriarch. Servants, their children, cousins, their children, anybody who happened to be under the authority of that patriarch. And it was much the same in the Old Testament. There the term is bedar, father's house. And then I stopped and did what I should have done at the beginning and said, no, this is supposed to be about theology. In theology, we're talking about God. So let's look at God. And what you discover then is that all through the Bible, among the commonest pictures of what God is like are pictures that come from family. God is like father and like mother. God is like the Goel in the Old Testament, the kinsman redeemer. And the older family member who, when there's trouble in the family, looks after the people who are weaker and cares for them. And very often, the people of God are described as the children of the family. Very often adopted children, not born into the family, both in the Old Testament and even more strongly in the New, especially when the gospel comes to reach people like us who were not born into the chosen people. And then I noticed the Bible doesn't hold up for us a model family to which we should conform. Nowhere. But But the Bible does hold up for us a number of virtues that we should be showing in our family relationships, whatever kind of family we live in. And in the Old Testament, central among those is this word that you can't really translate, chesed. It means something like loving kindness, faithfulness, those kinds of concepts. And you see already that in English I've used two different kinds of concept, ones that we just don't have one word for. We don't have a word for chesed. It means that the solidarity, the faithfulness, the love that one family member shows to another, or should do. Now, of course, Scripture being so real, very often what we see in the Bible is where chesed breaks down, where this solidarity and love is not shown by members of the family to each other. But it's persistently held up as the ideal, and it's persistently attributed to God. The word is applied to God more often than it's ever applied to human beings throughout Scripture. So, no model family, no pattern of what our family must look like, but a whole series of stories of God at work in families as they are, and some of them very broken, and a virtue that we should be showing in our relationships with each other within our families. Turning to marriage, you would think that the thing was very much simpler. And in a sense it is, because I could here start, like Jesus and Paul do, with Genesis 2. And the purpose of marriage. In Genesis 2 verse 18, it's not good for a human being to be alone. We're not made by the Creator to exist as proud individuals. We are made by the Creator to be in relationship with each other. And it's a relationship of similarity and difference from those very first creation stories, in both of them. And then, we notice as the story goes on, it's not good for the human being to be alone, so God puts the human being to sleep, and from his flesh makes a partner for him, having found that none of the animals will do. Presumably God knew that already, but perhaps the man needed to be had things explained to him. When Adam sees Eve, who hasn't yet got her name and nor really has he says, "This at last is flesh of my flesh, bone of my bone." We are made by the Creator for each other and for partnership. We are made to be united and not to be separated. But it's interesting. When you start to look in Scripture, you would think that marriage would be the primary examples of chesed, that virtue of loving kindness and faithfulness. But it's not. The primary example of chesed in the Old Testament is the story of Ruth and Naomi. You know how the story goes. A family goes to a foreign country, dad dies, and the two sons die, having already married women from that foreign country, and the three women set off back home to what is for the young women a foreign land. And Naomi, the mother-in-law, says to both of them, "No, look, girls, really you should go back home to your parents. Maybe there you can find new husbands, because even if I get married tonight and get pregnant straight away, my sons aren't going to be any good to you. You go home." And they both say no. And they both carry on with her to the strange place that they're now thinking of as home, Bethlehem. And Naomi says to them again, "No, really, go back to your families. There's no point in you carrying on with me. I've nothing." And at second urging, Orpah turns around and goes home, having embraced her mother-in-law. But Ruth stays with her and says, "Where you go, I'll go. Where you stay, I'll stay. Even when you die, that's where I'm going to be buried." That's chesed. That's this relationship of faithfulness and loving kindness that's held up for us as the model of what our families should aspire to. And in the New Testament, the primary example of chesed is Jesus. In neither testament is the primary example of this great family virtue a marriage.